What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? Real democracy! When do we want it? Now!
Welcome to Real Democracy Now. I'm Nivek Thompson, and Real Democracy Now is a podcast for people who think we can and should improve how democracy works. This podcast looks at democracy from different angles to help you think about how democracy might be improved. My guest today is South Australia's Premier Jay Weatherill. Premier Weatherill is South Australia's 45th Premier and has held that position since 2014. He's been a Member of Parliament since 2002, holding numerous portfolios. Under his leadership, South Australia has become a leading light in democratic reform in Australia and around the world. In particular, South Australia has been at the forefront in the use of deliberative mini-publics, or citizens' juries as they're often called here in Australia. In South Australia, they have conducted citizens' juries on how to ensure Adelaide, South Australia's capital, has a safe and vibrant nightlife, how cars and bicycles can share the road safely, how to manage unwanted litters of dogs and cats, how to fund major infrastructure, and most recently, how the state should respond to a Royal Commission's findings about the nuclear fuel cycle. I've invited Premier Weatherill to be a guest on Real Democracy Now, Can We Do Democracy Differently, to get a politician's perspective on deliberative mini-publics. Thanks for joining us today, Premier.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's kick it off. Can you tell us a bit about how you came to be interested in deliberative democracy and deliberative mini-publics in particular?
Well, I think that a really big contemporary political issue is the loss of faith in our political system. So a loss of trust in politics and a loss of trust in politicians. And so I thought that one remedy for that is to involve more people in the decision-making process. So really to reverse the thing, for politicians to trust the public more in the decision-making process. So I think people have felt locked out of our democracy in the political system, and that I think has found its expression in a range of ways. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to change things. One, because I think it was going to help us be a better government, but frankly, it was a survival thing as well. I mean, people are losing faith in our government. It was a government of long-term, long-standing, and we were trying to revitalise it. And this was one of the ways in which I thought we could do that.
There's obviously a lot of different possibilities for democratic reform. What attracted you to deliberative mini-publics?
Well, it's really just one of the tools in the toolkit to really address this question of a loss of faith in politics. And I've been really heavily influenced by the work of Daniel Yankelevich. He wrote this book called Coming to Public Judgment. And there's a really powerful observation there about the mobilising that most important resource that we have, and that's the common sense judgment of everyday citizens, and trying to recalibrate the relationship between the expert and the citizen. I think that's at the heart of some of the cynicism about politics and politicians. I mean, we're really part of the politicians and the public servants and various other academics are really, part of the expert class, and there's a massive gap between the starting point of ordinary everyday citizens and the expert. And I think they've come to become suspicious, if you like, of the so-called experts, and we need to close that gap. And a way of doing that is using so-called citizens' juries or deliberative mini-publics to really get the experts and the citizens much closer together to get citizens thinking of themselves as citizens, not self-interested individuals that are having things done to them, but rather they accept the responsibility of becoming part of a public that comes together and acts in its own interests, not necessarily each individual interest, but in the interests in a group sense.
Oh, that's very interesting. I think there's been a lot of talk around that citizens are cynical about experts, but certainly when you experience deliberative mini-publics, they're also very appreciative of expertise.
Absolutely. And when you allow them to be in charge, and you say you can bring in any expert you want, and you can, and they're there to serve you, not to dictate to you. I think you then recalibrate the relationship between the citizen and the expert, and that's as it should be, because there are value judgments that are to be made here, and the value judgments are really the province of the citizen, and that's the expert shouldn't close down debate by saying, here's the expert opinion, which have embedded value judgments contained within them.
Yes, I think I certainly agree with that. So look, South Australia has a number of different innovative approaches to engaging with your community. How do you decide what issues to take to a citizens' jury?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we've tended to take things that with the traditional system hasn't worked. So something that got stuck and was where the current system had become really deadlocked. And a good example of that was the first one we used, where we were trying to deal with this issue of alcohol-fuelled violence. But some of the solutions were seen by people in the community as really destroying the vibrancy of the city and and being a bit of the fun police. So we had this objective about minimising alcohol-fuelled violence, but some of the measures that we were trying to get through the Parliament to deal with that were seen as draconian. And so we couldn't get a solution to that problem. So we constructed the citizens' jury to ask the question. And I think when you get a really shouty public debate where both sides are shouting at each other, and you don't get any reconciling of the views, they're the sorts of things that I think are amenable to a citizens' jury. So complex issues which require, if you like, working through and reconciling of different interests, where you can actually come up with often it's a pragmatic compromise where you are trying to achieve objectives that point in different directions, but you can come to a better landing if you have a process like this.
You've initiated a number of citizens' juries to date, and there's a major 350-person citizens' jury coming soon to look at the future of nuclear fuel in South Australia. What do you see as the pros and cons or strengths and weaknesses of deliberative mini-publics?
Well, in terms of the negatives, there's a perception negative that somehow we're outsourcing our decision-making responsibility to a small group of people, and why should they be privileged? They're not elected. So that becomes an obvious criticism. The other criticism is, how can a small number of people represent the views of the whole of the community? I mean, couldn't you get a random result? The two answers to those questions are that really we are still accepting responsibility for government to make the decision. We're only asking citizens to assist us in that regard. And the way I like to describe it is we're not necessarily consulting on the answer, we're really consulting on the permission to decide. So, has the community sort of now had a sufficiently mature and developed debate so that it could be said, well, now it's over to you as the politicians to make the decision? I think that puts us in a much stronger position to make sure that we make our judgments fully informed with all the perspectives. So that's the answer to the first bit. In relation to the second bit, the idea that it's just a small group of people and might get some sort of random result, it's remarkable what happens actually in a group of even just 50 citizens for a citizens' jury. The outliers tend to quickly become identified, and even with that, they tend to reach quite a serious consensus about the way forward. It's remarkable how much commonality in the way in which people's positions shift over time, and you tend to get if you're like a congealing of a point of view around a consensus, if you like, tends to be arrived at, and which I think is remarkable, given that when you choose these juries, they do reflect at the beginning that they're just the ordinary top of mind opinions that people come into any debate with, but after they have the opportunity to assemble all the facts and hear all the opinions and work through all the issues, it's amazing how much unity that can be achieved. So we think they're the responses to the negatives. In terms of the positives, the remarkable thing about these things is that if there's one single perspective that's expressed by the jurors, leaving aside the merits of the issue they're looking at, it's this enormous sense of privilege that they have in being asked to do this. They just love the fact that they're participating in our democracy in this way. And they see that as such a massive contrast to how they feel ordinarily, locked out except once every 3 or 4 years being asked to vote. And in the meantime being consulted with, but really not properly consulted with, really feeling as though a lot of what passes for consultation looks like things have already been decided and they're just, they're being asked really to rubber stamp it and people just going through the motions. So that's important. But really the most powerful thing I think of all is, and this has become manifest in the Nuclear Fuel Cycle Royal Commission, is it gives us an insight into, as experts, into the starting point of ordinary citizens. So we had a Royal Commission report that was produced with a series of experts. Now we've taken that to a first citizens jury of 54, I think, citizens. And what they did is helped us to produce a guide, if you like, to a very long and complicated technical report. And what that now enabled us to do is to understand the starting point of an ordinary everyday citizen, so that when we go out to the broader consultation process, which is what we're doing now over the next 3 months, we know what the gap is, the starting point in knowledge of people that haven't been well schooled in these complex issues of nuclear power and radiation. And we can actually then start in the right place, knowing what issues need to be dealt with first, how to approach the question so that people can consume this information and be active decision participants in the decision-making process. So I think that's the great power, that those last two things, restoring faith in our political process and giving us as decision-makers really some very important information about how we should communicate with the community to take what is mass opinion and translate it into public judgment through these deliberative processes.
And I think that example you just gave then is quite interesting because I'm not aware of anyone else in Australia, and I'm not sure about the rest of the world, actually using a citizens' jury to set the agenda for the broader consultation. Yeah. So that's quite an innovation there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a real insight that we had, is that if it was hard to know where to start in the report, and really a lot of the things that I would have thought would have been top of mind for people, it didn't end up actually being the most important issues that they wanted to decide. They quickly went to a point in the report that I would have thought would have been further down the list for them, but it ended up being an important threshold issue that they wanted resolved.
It's interesting, isn't it? That you can be surprised by what people bring to you in these sort of processes. So,
yeah, well, we start with, we start with a body of knowledge, and I think we get into so much trouble in government in supplying the answers to questions that people didn't know were being asked. And unless you go through the journey with people to actually construct the question, then all of the little compromises as you try and resolve those questions that go along the path aren't seen or understood by the community. What we tend to do is just reveal the answer. And we don't take people on the journey with us through the decision-making process. So when we, at the end, reveal this thing, we present it as perfect or as good and something we're proud of. And it might have been the product of a really intelligent set of, decision-making processes. But if you haven't been through them, every one of the sort of little twists and turns and compromises that are embedded in the final decision just look like flaws, and people ask all the obvious questions that we've worked through, but we haven't taken them on the journey. And so I call this announce and defend as opposed to debate and decide. And that's what we're trying to do with our decision-making process.
I think that's so true. I remember someone telling me about a process where citizens sat down with road builders, and the things that the road builders thought were important to the citizens in terms of their drive to work proved not to be what was important to them at all. And it was quite a revelation for the experts to realise that, all the values underpinning their work weren't actually reflected in the values of the citizens.
Save a lot of money that way if you spoke to them first. Yeah.
That's right. So look, South Australia is well known for democratic innovation. I think you were one of the first to let women vote, and amongst a number of other things. And I know you've got a major event in October of this year, 2016, called Open State. which is billed as 10 days of collaboration, innovation, ideas and enterprise to address the complex challenges of the future. And I'm also aware that it has quite a theme of democracy running through it. What's the thinking behind this event?
Well, we wanted to show off, really. We wanted to show to the world that we're doing this sort of work, but we also wanted to take it to the next level. We wanted to really take our democratic initiatives and actually grow them and expand them and learn what's happening in other places in the world. I mean, we also believe that this notion of openness and the democratic decision-making process is at the heart of attracting new ideas to our community, new people to our community, new technologies. And we certainly need that as a state. We're undergoing a massive economic transformation with the loss of our car industry, which is a big challenge to our identity, which was always a bit of a bedrock of our manufacturing base, which was always a substantial part of our economy. So we're needing to reconfigure how we operate as a state, and to do that, we want to draw on all of our resources. And one of our resources is being known as a test bed of innovation. And to do that, you need an open and democratic system. I mean, we were very taken by that Richard Florida thesis about the creative class, which was that, the modern sort of businesses and opportunities don't necessarily congeal around, some of the old methods like cheap power, cheap water, cheap land and cheap labour. They really now tend to aggregate around creative people. And creative people are attracted to places that have open and permissive democratic regimes that they're running. And so, that's what we're trying to promote. We want to build on what we've got. We think it is a tradition, as you said, the first place in the world actually for women to stand for Parliament, and also the second place in the world where they could vote. But we're very proud of that. And really very early democratic traditions back in 1857, responsible government, where the whole community was allowed to vote. So, we think this is a South Australian trait, but I think in the modern world where collaboration, innovation is all very much connected to ideas of openness and expression, we think this is also an economic opportunity.
And so, Premier, what do you think is the essence of a real democracy?
Well, I love the definition that Mark Moore, who's one of the thinkers that came and helped us into this, and he talked about the idea of talking into existence a public that can act in its own self-interest. I think that's there's not one notion of the public. It's something that has to be continually talked into existence. You want people to behave as citizens, not as self-interested individuals, so that collectively we come together and solve the challenges we have as a community. So how do you set aside what may be in my personal interests and actually think about the interests of the community more broadly? So how do you set aside the selfishness and think of the other, and to actually understand that strengthens all of us if we're able to have a community that behaves in that way? And I think that's the essence of a democracy, and that's what we're trying to achieve with our reforms.
So finally, if you could change one thing about our current system, what would it be?
Well, that's a really interesting question. How would I change our system? I think I would. It's the generosity of spirit of actually coming together to actually just the cynicism that passes for much of the daily discourse in terms of our media-saturated society. I think that's really the enemy of what we're trying to achieve here. So toning down on the cynicism. I mean, the amount of anger and hatred that's directed at politicians, I think is just a self-destructive thing. I mean, politicians are no more than the people that we've chosen to represent ourselves. I mean, they're just ordinary people just like the rest of us. And, toning down the cynicism and try and find a way in which we can come together to improve our democracy. It sounds a bit Pollyanna-ish, but I hope that that's something that can be achieved. I'm sure it's necessary if we're going to make the changes that are necessary.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us today, Premier. For more information about what South Australia is doing with citizens' juries and other democratic reforms, please visit www.realdemocracynow.com.au for the show notes. Thanks for listening to Real Democracy Now! You can find more about today's topic in the show notes at www.realdemocracynow.com.au. If you enjoyed this program, please subscribe to this podcast, write a review, share the podcast with your friends, and join the conversation on the webpage or on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to know what you think is the essence of a real democracy.